A very good morning to each and everyone assembled here online and also in the classroom. I think this is the first time that we are having a special lecture, a distinguished online lecture where it's going to be held in hybrid mode. And we are very happy to have a very special guest with us to be talking about UN peace operations and its relevance in the 21st century. Major General Dr. A.K. Bordolai, who has been associated with UN peacekeeping operations for a really long time, as a practitioner and more importantly also as an academic who recently defended his PhD on this topic. So it's a very happy occasion for us to welcome him to deliver this distinguished online lecture to our students and also to the students of other departments of Manipal Academy of Higher Education. This lecture, as already mentioned in the poster and other social media channels, this is supported by Department of Geopolitics and International Relations in association with the UNESCO Peace Chair, which is held by the university since 2009, and the chairholder is Professor M.D. Nalapat. So thank you so much, sir, for joining us this morning to deliver this distinguished online lecture. So before I introduce you, I would like to first invite Dr. Nand Kishore, who's the head of the Department of Geopolitics and International Relations, to deliver the welcome remarks.
Thank you, Dr. Dhanashree. I think it's a very important occasion for us, and also as a topic, it has greater relevance for India, because India has been in the forefront of most of the peacekeeping operations itself. India has contributed extensively, and perhaps this is also something that's comparatively less studied in international relations. Even in our own courses, if you look in geopolitics and international relations, there has not been a very significant portion of it which we are using as such. But nevertheless, it's picking up, and we are encouraging a lot of students to do on this one, because 250,000 personnel have worked in the UN peacekeeping forces in more than 49 different operations, and more than 175 people have laid their lives. That means India's contribution has been exemplary. India has been suggesting a lot of reforms, a lot of new additions that can come and enhance the UN peacekeeping forces. Now, there are newer dimensions to UN peacekeeping forces. Now, environmental security has come, climate change has come. There are so many dimensions apart from the conflict scenario that were regularly seen. But fortunately or unfortunately, in the last few months, I think UN peacekeeping forces were expected in places like Afghanistan. I think UN itself as an institution has been questioned. What has been the role of UN peacekeeping force? Why are we not able to send across? What is happening at the UN? What is the type of importance that we are according? I think there is no better person than General Bordolai. I think he is the best person. He has served there, being a person. So I'm absolutely happy and feel honored to have General Bordolai at the Department of Geopolitics and International Relations. By all means, it also looks like I'm the only person who is in sync with the theme and the poster and to the presentation. I'm also wearing blue. There is a blue background here. The presentation is blue. Everything looks like that. Very happy to have you here, sir. We would love to have more and more lectures from your side. As a practitioner, you also have a PhD, so it's more humbling sort of an experience for us to have. Professor M.D. Nalapat has personally conveyed his regards and message to you, and he also said the same, that best topic and the best person is delivering this lecture. So thank you so much for joining at the Department of Geopolitics and International Relations. Perhaps your lecture will inspire many more students to work on India's role in the peacekeeping operations. As such, UN peacekeeping itself, I expect that it will become a very interesting topic for many of our students to take it up. So hearty welcome to you, and we look forward to having you many more times. Thank you, sir. Over to you, Dr. Dhanashree.
Thank you so much, sir. So with that welcome remarks, I would like to once again invite Bordolai sir to this distinguished online lecture. And as Nankishore sir mentioned, this is a very important topic to work on. And in fact, a lot of our students have worked on this topic for their term papers in the past and still continue to do so. Even in the current batch of students, there are many who are trying to work on the peacekeeping operations as a case in point, and also India's contribution. So I'm very sure that this is something that everybody would like to know more about. And somebody who has been there and has experienced all of it, I'm sure they would get a better insight to all these operations that India has been involved in, and also generally about the peacekeeping missions. And it's very important that this knowledge is also imparted to the next generation and to the students in particular who study international relations. So without wasting much time, let me just give a brief introduction about Major General A.K. Bordolai. I mean, it's a really long, decorated experience, and and I probably may take a long time to read it. So in that sense, please also give me some time to describe each and every decorations that he has been associated with in the past and continues to do so. So Major General Dr. A.K. Bordolai commissioned into Indian Army on 11 June 1977 as a graduate of National Defence Academy, Pune, India, and Defence Services Staff College, Wellington, India, and an alumnus of Tilburg University, the Netherlands, where he completed his PhD, in fact. General Bordolai was a brigade major of a brigade in Sri Lanka. He commanded an infantry battalion in Siachen Glacier and attended a higher command course in Army War College, Mau. After his command of an infantry brigade in the mountainous terrain and counter-terrorism operations in Upper Assam, he was posted to HQS Eastern Army Command as the Brigadier General Staff Operations. He commanded an infantry division in the Western Theatre of India from May 2010 to July 2011, and was the commandant of Indian military training team in Bhutan from October 2011 to January 2014. General has drawn rich experience from his earlier assignments as a UN military observer in Angola, Director SD3 UN Peacekeeping at Integrate HQs of MOD Army, Research Fellow UN Peacekeeping with United Services Institution of India, New Delhi, and the Deputy Head of the Mission and Deputy Force Commander in UNIFIL, Lebanon from March 2008 to March 2010. Post-retirement from the Army on 30th April 2014, he is actively engaged with academic study of UN peace operations. And as I already mentioned, he holds a PhD on UN peace operations from Tilburg University, the Netherlands. So as you can see, he has a wide range of experience, and very importantly, from practitioner to academia. And that's something that you can rarely find. And that's something that we all would love to know more about, from both perspectives. I'm sure he has a lot to contribute. So now I would like to invite Major General A.K. Bordolai to deliver his lecture. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Dhansri and Dr. Nankishore. Can you hear me?
Yes, it works fine.
My sincere thanks to Manipal Academy of Higher Education to give me this platform to share my experience with the very, very informed crowd. Let me tell you in the beginning only, talking to someone in a manner like this I'm speaking is not a very good thing. You lose the eye contact. Actually, you've not been able to strike a rapport with the students, or not students, I will say audience, participants. But these are the side effects of the pandemic. So other day when I was talking to Dr. Dhansri, I said, I hope I would be able to see some people at least when I talk to them. A second part is that, although inspired the long, I'll tell you the biodata what Dr. Dhansri read out, I am not an expert on this subject. What has happened that I have been a practitioner and I have been a student and I'm a student again. Only thing I can say, maybe I have become slightly a better student, because every time I started reading anything by the scholars or academicians like all of you, before that I thought that I knew a lot, but when I start reading what they contribute, I realize that I know nothing. That's why I say I continue to study, and I do not know when my this education will end. Having said that, Dr. Nand Kishore also has brought out, this subject is not very popular, a very, very boring subject. Like the famous cliche that we remember God, doctor, and military only at the time of crisis. Similarly, people start talking of the UN peace operations when there's a crisis, when there's a conflict, it cannot be resolved by anyone else. Yes, Dr. Nand Kishore also brought out, referred to the subject of Afghanistan. A lot of debates and discussion had taken place or still taking place that why UN cannot participate in Afghanistan or has even failed. Anyway, we can talk about later. But what is the truth is that despite its long history in peacekeeping operations, that the UN peacekeeping continues to come under criticism more because of its past failure in a couple of peacekeeping operations in places like Rwanda and Somalia, and less talked of what it has, how and what it has contributed towards conflict management. And there are, of course, no set evaluation framework how to judge a peace operations. Given such a track record, there is a question mark on the relevance of peacekeeping operations. Now, to understand why the peacekeeping operation is still relevant or is still effective or not, it is very important that before that we must have some kind of evaluation framework. But to develop a framework like this, we must know why a peacekeeping operation either succeed or fail. At the same time, peacekeeping operations may succeed or fail with a number of factors, but there are factors which could be strategic, operational, or organizational variable on which peacekeepers have got very little control of it. Therefore, it would be slightly unfair to blame on the peacekeeping operation the why peacekeeping operation has failed. Now, why does the peacekeeping operation succeed or fail? I would say that even despite about 71 peacekeeping operations and the 12 are still in place, it continues to come under criticism. And there could be a number of reasons, like I said, where peacekeeping operation can fail or succeed. Now, because of the series of failures in 1990s, UN had ordered a series of the studies, and finding of some of the studies or most of the studies are still valid. So looking at the studies, one could find out or establish at least 3 common areas, strategic, operational, and tactical reasons to ascertain why peacekeeping operation may either fail or succeed. Now, the subject that is related to the conceptual thinking of the peacekeeping operation or UN Security Council can be termed as a strategic reasons. Similarly, capability of the peacekeeping operations or how the interpretation of the basic principles of peacekeeping operation impact on the outcome of the peacekeeping operations impact at the operational level. When it comes to implementing the mandate at a tactical level, the line between operational and tactical factors gets blurred. Therefore, to avoid confusion, it is easier to club, or it can always club, operational factors with the tactical factors. To give an example, use of force, it is one of the principles of the peacekeeping operation, and discussion on this subject can transcend from a strategic to tactical reasons. This morning, I intend to share with you some of these such factors with drawing examples of some of the past and future peacekeeping operations. Coming to the first one is that ambiguity in the norms. Now, what are even norms? Essentially, in the simple word, these are the collective expectation of the peacekeepers' behavior while implementing the mandate. The list of the event norms are not finite. It can be adhering to the 3 principles of peacekeeping. It could be good conduct on part of the peacekeepers. It is respect to gender sensitivity, human right, and the list can continue. But if you look at the event piece of norms, like I said, list is not finite. It is generally easier to understand, comprehend the event norms, except for the 3 principles of peacekeeping operations, because their interpretations vary from person to person, scholars to scholar, and troop contributing contingents to troop contributing contingents. It results in impacting on the outcome of the peacekeeping operation. Now, the consent, impartiality, and use of force are the 3 basic principles of the peacekeeping operations. Adherence to these principles provide legitimacy and credibility to event peace operations. These are also known as Holy Trinity. Now, when the peacekeeping operations get deployed, they're supposed to get deployed after it has been consented by the parties to the conflict, and obviously received, obtained consent at the Security Council, members, 15 members, the P5 members with no veto and 2/3 majority. So it provides, I would say, legitimacy and credibility. Impartiality means that peacekeepers must be seen impartial and also to be in the deeds also that be seen as impartial. Use of force is again connected to these 2 principles. Now, use of force, that is, peacekeepers are allowed to use force in self-defense. Now, coming to the first principle, the consent. Now, it is rarely that consent is available at strategic, at operational, and tactical level. More often than not, that consent is given by the parties to the conflict either under pressure or in return of the expectation of something else from the international community. Now, when these conditions are diluted, the consent is generally recanted by the parties to the conflict, resulting with catastrophic results in the conflict area. I'll give you one example from Somalia. Somalia is an example where there was no consent, then consent was given, then was withdrawn. At the time when the peacekeeping operations to get deployed, the conditions in Somalia was the chaos and a complete mess. Given the circumstances, the Somalia coming out of 2 decades of the civil war under the rule of Siad Barre, there was no effective government to give consent for the deployment of the peacekeeping operation. The 2 main parties to the conflict, one led by Muhammad Mahdi and General Farad Aidid, they were the only one who could give consent. It was easier to get the consent of Al-Mahdi, but Farad Aidid was a tough nut to crack. But Muhammad Sanoun, at that time, the head of the mission is the SRSG. He was an, I think, Algerian diplomat. He could work around Farad Aidid and convince him that it will be good to deploy 500 unarmed peacekeepers so they can help escorting the humanitarian convoys inside Somalia. And he agreed. But down the line, before the first event mission could get deployed, then Secretary General Boutros Ghali proposed to the Security Council, without the knowledge of either the Mr. Sanoun or Aidid, that there should be a deployment of 3,000 peacekeepers. To Aidid, it was a breach of faith. So what happened thereafter, you would have heard about the Somalia conflict. As a result, first incident what taken place on 5 June 1993, when the Pakistani peacekeepers raided one ammunition dump of Muhammad Aidid without his permission. 24 Pakistani peacekeepers died, 5 I think taken hostage, and 40 got injured. Now this enraged then head of the mission, Admiral Jonathan Howe, as an American admiral, then American also joined in, and he announced a bounty of 25,000 US dollar on Aidid. And this was, people call it, the academicians and scholars call it the cultural blunder. And on 24 June, Jonathan Howe personally had overseen attacking one peace meeting with using several half a dozen Cobra helicopters and firing 20 mm caliber guns. Hundreds of Somalian, innocent Somali people have died, including ladies and children, and some people, while trying to run away, I believe they were shot dead at a point blank range. And this was reported by, not known to many people, one journalist who used to report from the front line, Scott Peterson. He was present, he spoke to some people next day what had happened. And it was reported that this is one time that the Somali leaders actually wanted to have peace, finally. But it was supposed to be a peace meeting, but according to the peacekeepers, the Jonathan Howe, this was a terrorist meeting, so many people. So thereafter, it was a complete war between the Somali militant leaders and the UN peacekeepers. And between 3rd to 4th October, what had happened, you would have heard about that. And when US Rangers attacked, 23 Rangers were killed, 2 taken hostage, and bodies of 2 hostages were dragged through the streets of Mogadishu. The famous movie Black Hawk Down, and that it is known as crossing the line of Mogadishu. And what had happened, rippling effect was felt in all subsequent peacekeeping operations, Rwanda and former Republic of Yugoslavia. The question comes that why did Muhammad Aidid and Mahdi give in consent? To them, presence of any peacekeeper is interfering in their power struggle. At the same time, they wanted humanitarian aid in their areas. So they have compromised. As I said, in return of expectation of something, they normally give the consent. So this is one aspect I thought I would like to highlight to you. Now, impartiality is, of course, next principles of peacekeeping, and more often than not, it is also misinterpreted. Let me give you an example from the old peacekeeping mission of UNEF that is in Gaza, 1956. This was based on the report of the then Secretary General, Dag Hammarskjöld, when after deployment of the peace operation in Gaza, he reported to the Secretary of General Assembly that the people who were to participate in the peacekeeping operation are supposed to remain neutral. That no one from the P5 country will participate, nor any other country, peacekeeper, any other country which could have any geographical or political interest in that area. So that's how these 3 principles had emerged or developed after UN peace operation and emergency force in Gaza. So you would find in even charters and official document, you will rarely find the reference to the UN peacekeeping principles. They will not. So these are actually, it is a concept developed and accepted as a tradition over a period of time. But what happened was, down the line, that since the contours of the conflict had changed, with the thousands of civilians, innocent civilians, mostly women and children becoming casualties, and vicious conflict become the center of the kind of conflicts, you needed capable peacekeepers. But these capable peacekeepers are rarely available but for a few countries, a developed nation from the Western world and the P5 countries, and they were not allowed to participate. Therefore, the concept of impartiality had replaced the concept of neutrality, that they were allowed to participate. That in even today's book, you find reference of impartiality as one of the principles of peacekeeping operation. In spite of that, impartiality is a principle that is a word almost confused regularly, either intentionally or unintentionally. To some, it is synonymous to word neutrality. Let me give you an example from, again, going back in time, Rwanda. You know the one Rwanda famous genocide which had taken place 1994 on 6 April, when the president of Rwanda, General Habyarimana, died in an airplane crash. The Hutu militias Interahamwe came down heavily on this Tutsi minority. They killed the Hutu moderate Prime Minister Agathe and also 10 Belgian peacekeepers. Now, while the force commander, General Dallaire, he, with a handful of peacekeepers, he tried his best to save as many people as possible. Yet, some of the contingents remain as a mute spectator to what was happening. They're probably looking back towards the home country, looking for orders, what should be done. And French, Americans, Italian, Belgians, they asked the peacekeepers only to evacuate their national. As far as impartiality of the Belgians are concerned, their impartiality, status of impartiality was suspected from the moment they landed up. About 450 special forces personnel from Belgium landed up in Rwanda in November 1993. They were found bragging themselves in the local bars and using derogatory remarks against African people. So, and Hutu never liked Belgium because they were the past colonial masters and they always support the Tutsis and they always wanted them to go back. So therefore, the impartial status, when it is lost, that it is very difficult to get back. And now I'm coming to the third principle, the use of force. Now, as per the UN Charter, force is allowed to be used even Chapter 6. But normally it is a myth or lack of understanding or deliberate misunderstanding or misinterpretation. The force cannot be used unless that it is an intervention mission, the force mission by force intervention. Whereas you are allowed to use in the defense of the peacekeepers, in defense of the civilians, and also in the defense of the mandate. It is, of course, debatable issue, continue to be debated, and some people, many even peacekeepers, both practitioners and senior mission leaders, I'll talk about later, take shelter behind this ambiguity not to use force to get out of the problem. Let me give you an example of former Republic of Yugoslavia. Again, I am trying to draw your attention to, you would have heard about it, Srebrenica massacre. Between 9 to 11 July, when the Bosnian Serbs started attacking the Muslims in Srebrenica, this was supposed to be one of the protected zone, and they took 50 Dutch peacekeepers as hostages. The Dutch peacekeeper Colonel Karamat, if I remember his name, or I'm convincingly trying not to spell his name because I'm slightly confused, I'm not very comfortable about it, that he asked for NATO airstrike. NATO airstrike never came till 11th. Now, is it, if the NATO airstrike had come, possibly history of former Republic of Yugoslavia would have been different? Is it because that senior mission leader, including Force Commander General Bernard, obsession of adhering to the principles of peacekeeping and remaining impartial and neutral is the reason, or fear of buying fatal casualties to peacekeepers when you use force against Bosnia? Truth will not come out, but the people say there's a reports that at that time some kind of negotiation was going on between the European Union and President Slobodan Milosevic, and if the force was used, it would have enraged that Bosnian Serbs, maybe more peacekeepers would have died. But what had happened was that, you know, that thousands of Bosnian Muslims have died. Now, not using force, even to save innocent human lives, have raised the question of local legitimacy of the UN peace operations. I'm not referring to the legitimacy of UN peace operations, which is derived from the signing of the peace agreement, approval of the Security Council resolution, and there is a multinational peace operations. Now, UNPROFOR, in the name of the mission, even if it is a multinational peacekeeping operations and approved at the highest level, does not mean that it had local legitimacy, because ultimately in the conflict zone, the way the peacekeepers intervene, it is going to affect the life of the human beings, not the animals. Therefore, outcome of the peacekeeping operation have to be seen or must be seen from the point of view of those who suffer the most. To the poor Muslim of Bosnia, that UNPROFOR or UN peacekeeping was a big failure, and it was not a ethically legitimate peacekeeping operations. Now, this brings me to next issue of the mandate. Very often, mandate is cited, or the weak mandate, an unclear mandate is cited, one of the reasons of UN peace operations inability to perform. Yes, it is true that if the mandate is clear, it is supported by adequate resources, it is easier to perform. But mandate can never be absolutely clear. Mandate is a product of political compromise. As it was always a political compromise even earlier, even now. You would see in Congo 1960 what had happened. During the secessionist movement of Katanga, then President and Prime Minister of Congo approached United Nations requesting for military intervention, citing Belgium's intervention for inciting violence. Now, this created a dilemma in the minds of the decision makers at New York, because to be able to provide any kind of assistance, one will have to first ascertain that actually Belgium was behind inciting violence. And for that, first a discussion has to take place. Now, if the positive outcome of the discussion, by this what I mean that yes, Belgium has actually incited violence, that means it would be put to vote. When you put to vote in the Security Council, and we're very sure they knew that it is likely to be vetoed at least one of the Western nations, then even Security Council would not have been able to help any kind of assistance. They found a way around that. The Secretary General was authorized to take action within his power by the General Assembly by the Article of 99, and that's how these peacekeeping operations in Congo took place. Now, as referring that mandate continued to be that product of the political compromise, even now today. Just to inform you that a mandate is formulated is not that easy. In the Security Council, there is a unwritten tradition of pen holder system. That is, out of the P5 members, depending on the national interest, one of the P3 countries, that is the America, that is England and France, take the lead and they draft a mandate. This mandate is circulated among the 5 P5 members. Russia and America never is to take much of interest till such time. And after then some compromises take place. And thereafter, once they feel that it is likely to come through, then they circulate it to other 10 members of the Security Council. So finally, what comes out is that a very compromised mandate, it must suit the P3 men. So this system is traditional, follow tradition. It is not going to go out soon. So we have to learn to live with this. Now, it is not that mandate was not in the sense, the mandate is not become strong. Post 2000, the mandates of the peacekeeping operation have become much stronger and clearer. And peacekeeping operations have been given better teeth. Mostly under Chapter 7, they have been given a good force, and there have been instances when, even in Congo, the peacekeepers had used gunship against the rebel group. But question is that what do you do that mandate, suppose or before that, this is what I said, that still mandate is remain not very clear. It is reason because of, could be two reasons. One is that how the mandate is implemented is not told. Mandate is given, how it is to be implemented is not given out. Now it could be for several reasons. Two reasons are, one reason is that a lot of flexibility is given to the force commanders or the commanders on ground how to implement the mandate. Or second, that they deliberately left vague in return of some kind of, I think, in return of giving consent by the parties to the conflict. I'll give you an example slightly later. But next question is that, I'll give you the example later. For instance, in Lebanon, what happened? The Security Council resolution is 1706, which came up after the last war of 2006. Everybody knows the main stakeholders in Lebanon, more than the Lebanese government, Hezbollah, vis-a-vis Israelis. And whatever the mandate has been passed for the peacekeeping operation, it could not have taken place or approved without the tacit approval of the Hezbollah. But any reference to the Security Council resolution to Hezbollah, the 1701, it would have amount to crossing the red line of Hezbollah. So there is another Security Council resolution, it came up much before, that 1599, that it talks of disarming the militias. Every time this comes on the debate, the huge outrage from the Hezbollah side. So this is the second example of why this mandate is left vague in return of expectation of something else. But what do you do that when that the host nations, the government forces are the perpetrators of the violence? How do you implement the mandate? For instance, in South Sudan, on 11 July 2016, what had happened was about more than 200 to 300 SPLA soldiers stormed Terrain Hotel, which housed most of the civilian peacekeepers and international workers. They took them out, they beat them, abused them, they gang raped a few Western civilian employees and shot dead John Gatluck. He was a local reporter for one of the American daily. But a continuous plea from these people to nearby UN headquarters asking for help never worked out. Now, why the UNMISS, the force located nearby, did not react, or they were not possible to do it because of the political reason, because nearby contingent which was there, wrong on my part to name any contingent, because they had some political or strategic and economic interest in that country, it will not be known. But what had happened, what is known is that UN peacekeepers did not train purely on humanitarian ground. Either they unable or they were prevented, but a lot of civilians died. But that brings me to next issue of the protection of the civilian. Now, protection of the civilians become the core subject of most of the peacekeeping operations. Recent policy that has been laid out by UN headquarters in 2019 talks of the 3 layers of actions for protecting the civilian population. Now, this has been generally by and large endorsed by most of the member states. But there are a lot of gap between the concept and practices. Now, when there is a gap between concept and the practices, there will be negative consequences. There will be always gap, but it is important on part of the policymakers to reduce the gap as much as possible. However, at the same time, in spite of this ambiguity in this norm of the protection of the civilians, there are instances when some of the peacekeeping contingents never fail to protect the civilians. I'll give you one instance of going back in time of 1993 in former Republic of Yugoslavia. One contingent, Nordbed 2, it comprised mostly the reservist, one Swedish reservist, one Dutch tank company, and Norwegian helicopter unit, commanded by a serving colonel. This colonel, after looking at the mandate, he formed his own mandate. He had issued clear-cut direction that anything which has to do with protecting the civilians, you take whatever action you want. And he had told his radio operator that if some calls come, then tell him I am not available. He came under a lot of political pressure, but he did not budge. In one incident, what took place with one of the platoon, his platoon is about anything which varies from the size about 23 to about 30 odd people, peacekeepers. They relieved one Croatian battalion from one of the church. No sooner they took up position, the Bosnian Serb unit, they relieved a Canadian unit, and a Croatian unit came, they surrounded the church compound. I told them that there are 3 Muslim nurses, please hand them over to us. His platoon commander radioed his commanding officer, asked him what is to be done. He told him, you know my instruction, you do what deems fit. He held on to the position in spite of coming under direct and indirect firing weapons. He did not budge. Finally, the Croatian unit left them and he succeeded. Though there are examples that people can hold on to it. But finally, what happens that when the peacekeepers, these are moral obligations of the peacekeepers, they're to honor the commitment which is expected on their part when they decide to participate in peacekeeping operation to bring peace in a conflict zone. Now, it brings to me the next point of the peace agreement. The peace agreements are basically agreement between the parties to the conflict and the international community agreeing to resolve the problem with any means other than use of violence. Now, in the context of UN peace operations, ceasefire is one such agreement that UN is allowed to freedom of movement in implement the mandate. The signing of the peace agreement does not mean that they will honor the commitment, because taking your mind back, I have said consent is never absolute. It is always conditional. So everything what I have spoken so far are interlinked. But at the same time, peace agreement peace operations which is deployed after an inclusive peace agreement has got a better chances of success than a peace operation which get deployed without any peace agreement. Let me give you some examples from some past operations and then followed by the current peace operation. I'll come to Angola first. Angola, the BICES agreement which took place, it failed. Now, they agreed to have elections, but when the election results were announced, when UNITA, which is supported by South Africa and Americans, and on the other side, government forces MPLA, generally supported by the Communist Bloc or East Bloc, when the elections were held, and after the election, Savimbi, he lost the election, civil war broke out again. There could be a number of reasons why the peace accord had failed. I am talking of the BICES accord. First reason is that when the BICES accord was signed, there was no third party guarantee. Second is that nobody understood actually what Savimbi wanted. For instance, in my perception, Savimbi, he joined UNITA, it was his third party. Before that, he was in 2 different parties. In both the parties, he had number 2 position as a vice president. That means what? That means Savimbi never accepted the second position. He wanted the first position. And when he agreed to go through the process of election, possibly he presumed that he will win in the election. But when he lost, he. Next is that elections were held when there was the security situation was not even under control. For instance, before the elections, armies of both the sides were supposed to disarm, demobilize. The weapons and arms and ammunition supposed to have been collected. The weapons were collected. They kept in not a secure place, in the places where these people stayed. For example, in Savimbi's area, they handed over the weapons. The weapon storage was located within Savimbi's area, UNITA, and guarded by them. Can it work? It will never work out. The situation is not secure. Next is that United States of America always wanted to help UNITA and never supported this. They just wanted UNITA to come back to power. The next accord was the Lusaka Protocol. Now, when the Lusaka Protocol was signed, that Savimbi had lost a lot of territory and he was in back foot. Then it was a biased agreement because that in the previous protocols agreement, there was a ban of importing arms from outside the country. And since the new protocol did not mention about anything, that is, that actually means that that ban still remains on UNITA, the terrorist organization, whereas the government forces could import the arms. So this was done in a very clever manner. And moment the agreement was signed, within a couple of months, MPLA attacked the rebel forces. The civil war broke out again, and it continued till 2022 and until Savimbi died on 22nd February. I'll come to now Rwanda. I mentioned about the Rwanda. Rwanda was one conflict where UNAMIR was deployed. There was a peace agreement was signed. This is known as Arusha Agreement in August 1993. And in spite of that, that Hutu militias, they came down and started killing the people. It was a genocide, of course, is the black spot in the history of UN peacekeeping operations. Now, what had happened was, while the peace agreement was signed, they agreed for deployment of peacekeeping operation. The Hutu firstly never could digest the fact that Belgium was a colonial masters and they support the Tutsi minority. They could rule the Hutus for a long time. So, unknown to everyone, a Hutu power center had emerged. And the word that being Hutu was coined about a couple of years earlier. And this was something that not known to anyone. So what it needed was the incident like air crash of the president, the Hutu president, on 6th April for the genocide to begin. So in spite of the peace agreement, which was, we do not know exactly the correct definition of the problem, what is wanted, that peace agreement can fall apart. Now, peace agreement can fall apart for various reasons. I am here citing different examples from different peacekeeping regions why peace agreement can fall. These are the most important reasons. In case of Srebrenica, of course, there was no peace agreement. The Dayton peace agreement, which came towards the end of the mission, and 14 December 1995. If such peace agreement was concluded, I think history would have been different. Coming to Democratic Republic of Congo. Now, the lot of involvement of external powers. Can you imagine? The 4 peace agreement was signed within 1 year. Something is wrong, that means in each peace agreement. Otherwise, why the agreement will, it is something like every 3 months, every constitution of our country is being changed, amended. You know, something was wrong. But the last agreement where Joseph Kabila decided to relinquish his power, then of course agreement took place. But in spite of that, violence has not ceased. And because the lack of honesty in all kind of peace agreement, and also the peace agreement was not inclusive of the local actors and the local population. About this, I'll come to it later. So kind of peace agreement which take place in DRC, when the mineral rich country, where most of the Western nations are more interested to extracting as much riches as possible for the peace to come back, is a big challenge. In South Sudan, it took 5 years or 6 years after the comprehensive peace agreement was signed in 2005. And referendum was held for the population of South Sudan to agree whether they wanted to be part of Sudan or they wanted freedom. Obviously, they fought for so many years. I really do not know why this referendum was asked for. Somebody possibly had hope, maybe they will change their mind. To me, it is very difficult to understand why it was done. Anyway, as expected, 2011, they wanted independence. The South Sudan got independence, but they did not become independent. No sooner they became independent, they started fighting among different power groups. The number of groups are there, but if you search, you will find normally you find reference of Dinka and Nuer group. But there are so many groups are there. There are major two groups, tribal communities, one led by the president, one led by the vice president. They have been fighting for that. And plus, when South Sudan became independent, 50% of the oil booty from the Sudan has gone to South Sudan. There's no account for it. The power struggle continues. Two peace agreement took place 2015 in 2018 again. And it is a God only knows that how long these are going to, and how long these agreements going to hold. Because when peace agreement, any kind of elite looking peace agreement, which can look elite, can look inclusive, a good agreement, but unless they're inclusive and consider the grievances of the local population, they're not going to last. This is very difficult. And any peace agreement which is without a peace operation, without the peace agreement, actually is a political necessity. So there is no exit plan. Case in example is, of course, UNIFIL. That is a political necessity. That's why you find that it's very difficult. How do you define your exit policies? How do you lay down or identify or find out the benchmarks for success so that mission can close down and exit? Now, I was referring to that peace agreement. The peace agreement, unless these are inclusive and take note or consider the views of the local populations, the chances of success are limited. Now, the current concept of the peace building is a Western philosophy. They want to impose their way of democracy on a country where possibly they are still happy with a kind of a tribal feudalism. So they always look from outside. They do not try to find out what actually local population want. Now, besides a lot of international agencies who have got the stake for peace in the conflict area, there are number of local actors who know the problems. So they are, if the views are incorporated, they would be possibly more appropriate to contribute for return of the peace. Now, take the example of DRC. What started at the political struggle and access to the land, minerally rich land in eastern Congo between the original Congolese, then between Congolese and the Congolese which had come from Rwanda. Initially, it has become a national problem, national political problem. Then thereafter is a regional problem. Now, in this conflict and struggle, external actors jump in. So unless even till today, each problem and a conflict in Congo or is looked at as the micro level antagonism. It is fueled by the not looked at, it is fueled by micro level antagonism, but looked at as the macro level problem. So it is very difficult to solve such problem. Now, I said the local actors are better suited. Now, I was referring to that, the inclusivity of the local actors, and we must find out what the local want. Or I would say, putting it differently, that what is the grassroots problem? You know, there's the window to address the grassroots problem will not remain open for an unlimited period. It will close down, because what happened? Any insurgent or rebellion which begins anywhere in the world, including India, it always begins with a noble cause. They have a leader, they have a population support, the three factors. But at that point of time, when the administration want to wear them out, considering an illegitimate problem or non-legitimate problem, want to use force, it doesn't work. Then the fourth factor come in, that is the time the external forces waiting on the outside like hyenas, they jump in, the problem go out of the control. Now that point of time, it becomes difficult to address even the root cause. That's why I said that even the root causes also has got an expiry date. I mentioned earlier while referring to former Republic of Yugoslavia that mission leaders, head of the mission and force commanders, has a crucial role in implementing the mandate. In the peacekeeping operations, a mission is generally led by, barring for two missions where the force commanders and the mission leader, head of the mission is same, he is generally a political appointee, representative of the Secretary General known as SRSG. Now he draws his authority from the Secretary General. Similarly, the military force or the military peacekeeping force is a military force, is commanded by uniformed man. Difference is that since the Western nations rarely take part, the peacekeeping missions have become diverse and participation in peacekeeping operations is by choice, not out of compulsion. And at the same time, peacekeeping contingents and also the civilian population, as much as they would love to adhere to the laid down policy on command and control, hate these words command and control. So it is the command and control becomes more of a management and coordination even peacekeeping operation on part of both the head of the mission and the force commander, because the decision which is taken is a politico-military decisions and nobody wants to like to follow the laid down command and control. So it all depends on the head of the mission and force commanders, what kind of maturity and experience do you have to get everyone together, bring them on one platform and coordinate their operational activities to enhance the effectiveness of the peace operations. Now, as I said that SRSG is the head of the mission, he draws the power authority from the Secretary Generals. Now, when they interpret the mandate, earlier I mentioned that troop contributing countries' interpretation of the mandate and principles of peacekeeping based on their own interest. Even the senior mission leaders' interpretation of the mandates depending on how it suits them. And when times come, the crucial decision has to take place. For instance, saving human lives using force. They calculate the cost of such a decision. Should the outcome of the decision work counter toward their interest? But they are basically political appointees. To give you an example, imagine a situation in a conflict area some of the innocent civilian population were caught in crossfire between the two fighting rebel groups. It is a moral obligations and also mandate now, official mandate for the peacekeepers to go and intervene and save these human beings, innocent civilians. Now, when you do that, since two rebel groups are armed and they don't care for the mandate, obviously you have to use fire. And every time you resort to fire, it would be retaliated. When retaliation takes place, there are more chances of the peacekeepers buying casualties. And this will not be liked by the troop contributing countries, and then the politics come in. At the same time, suppose you don't participate and don't use force and remain as a mute spectator, hoping that they will listen, just giving statement after statement, adhere to the principles and even principle, respect human lives. And some of the civilian population die, hundreds maybe, in the conflict where thousands have already died. They think that who cares, it will be a local news and people forget about it. It's unfortunate, but this is the truth what happens. At the same time, there are cases where people have used force. I mentioned about Rwanda. The layer had gone out of his way to save a lot of civilian populations. One of his peacekeeper staff officer, Diagne, is a Congolese, a Senegalese peacekeeper. He died. He made a supreme sacrifice. There are in Côte d'Ivoire or Haiti, they were example of 2005. They have used heavy machine guns to kill the gang leader. In 2011, in Côte d'Ivoire, they have entered the presidential palace by use force and arrested the president. So there are cases. The same head of the mission who was there during Srebrenica massacre, Yasusi Akasi, he was very cautious. Even before that, he was also the head of the mission in Cambodia in 1992. Once in 1992, in 30 May 1992, his motorcade, along with the force commander, he came across a small roadblock. The roadblock was created by a handful of Khmer Rouge rebels, Pol Pot group. They did not want this motorcade to enter inside. Now, it was an obstruction to the freedom movement, and they had all the rights, reasons to use force. The deputy force commander, he objected to it. They said, no, you must use force. But Yasusi Akasi, who was there again in Yugoslavia later, he and the force commander decided it's better not to use force. Same reason they have cited later, that if you use force, this will enrage the Khmer Rouge rebels. They will possibly fire back at peacekeepers. Most peacekeepers will die and might as well go back. Now, I do not want to pass comment whether it's correct or wrong, but it had happened. So there are leaders who are like that, who has the courage to take crucial decision, who are leaders who do not take the decision. The next aspect I want to highlight is the Security Council. As I had mentioned earlier, the Security Council is the final authority to approve any peacekeeping operations. Now, what I mean is that it is not only approving the peacekeeping operations, the P5 members, 5 P5 members agree to it, and 10 out of 15 members endorse the resolution. There must be serious commitment from their side. Now, it doesn't happen because, like I said, a mandate is a compromise mandate. They may agree to a peacekeeping operation. They agree with a smaller strength of the peacekeeping operations. What had happened in case of Rwanda? In Rwanda, in fact, what had happened that when he asked for 35,000 troops, they gave him only 8,500. This is a compromise mandate and no serious commitment from the P5 members, the powerful lobby. Second thing is that defining the problem. Now, if you're unable to define the problem correctly, your prescription will be wrong. In case of former Republic of Yugoslavia, Americans thought this was an ethnic problem. France thought the problem between the elite and the commoners, and Chinese thought that this is an internal problem, so does not need intervention. It is only the behest of the few European nations and some of the non-aligned group that UN headquarters finally agreed to authorize a peacekeeping operation. That is a different matter, that when they have authorized that, they lack strategy and a clear-cut vision how to go about it. I spoke about it earlier. Now, budgetary support is the second aspect. Now, any peacekeeping operation which is deployed is supposed to be provided along with adequate financial support. After all, it boils down to money. You would have heard the previous administration, US administration, last administration time, they wanted to cut down the budget, UN contribution, the American contribution to UN. It looked like 2%, but 2% is level. When the budget is cut down, what happens? Obviously, the size of the peacekeeping mission will go down, number of troops will go down, number of related issues will come up. So the peacekeeping operation will not be effective. Now, who approves the budget? It is not the Security Council. Budget is approved by the General Assembly. But the General Assembly, it is dealt by the Fifth Committee. The Fifth Committee members also do not come outside the United Nations membership. They're part of the same United Nations members. So they're the same people drawn from different people and they communicate. So basically, again, it is a compromised solution when the peacekeeping operation takes place. Now, I know that I have painted a very, very grim picture of the UN peacekeeping operations, that the way peacekeeping operations have succeeded or failed. Now, therefore, I must try to find an answer, the last part of my presentation, that is the peace or are the peacekeeping operations still relevant or not? I would say that based on the past studies, it can be still seen the failure of the peacekeeping operation have not been able to contribute to implement the mandate is largely due to the lack of will on part of the peacekeepers and less of because the mandate or inadequate support. That is one. Second part is that budgetary support will remain is a constraint. We'll have to learn to work within. Third is that peace agreement does not mean that the peace agreement, if it is concluded, there will be chances of success. But unless the peace agreement is inclusive and consider the opinion and grievance of the local population, peace agreement have got very little to contribute. Third part is, or the fourth one, is that the contribution from the Western nation in the peacekeeping operation, difficult peacekeeping operation, is gradually declined and continue to remain like this unless the conflict directly impact these two contributing countries. For instance, in Mali, French are taking the lead. So therefore, large part of the peacekeeping force will continue to come from the global south. And peacekeeping operations are becoming more and more diverse. Now, diversity in peacekeeping operations have its own challenges, but the multinational participation in terms of diversity also can be positive. It can produce better results, provided the leaders can find ways to mitigate the challenges of diversity and can coordinate well and create better interoperability among the troop contributing contingents. And lastly, of course, to answer my own question, are the peacekeeping operations are relevant or not? Very difficult to answer whether peacekeeping operations have succeeded or not. But a recent meta study which has looked into about 70 odd research on the peacekeeping operation. And this study has been undertaken by 3 women scholars, Liz Howard, Barbara Walter, and Jenny Wallen. I think girl students and scholars will be more happy to hear that. I said their contribution, a scholarly contribution, is much better than the male or men folk, I would say. Most of the books, good work and contribution you'll find are from the women scholars. Now, they have concluded that the strong link between reduction of the bloodshed and effectiveness of the peacekeepers or effectiveness of peacekeeping operations. Therefore, I would say that I believe that rather than looking at where peacekeepers have failed, we must look at it that where and how peacekeeping operations have contributed in conflict management. Supposing in those conflict areas, like for South Sudan or in DRC now and earlier for Rwanda, if the peacekeeping missions were not deployed, what do you think would have happened? Do you think they would have reduction in bloodshed? I think I leave this answer to you. Anyway, like peacekeepers are not supposed to take the mankind to heaven or paradise. We're just to save them from hell. So here I end my presentation. I know it was a monologue. I don't like using PowerPoint presentations. Mostly these virtual presentations very, very difficult to strike a personal rapport with the students. And that too mostly speaking to someone that I'm sitting on my chair, my AC comfort and talking to you. I won't even know whether I have been sinking or not, but I'm ready to answer any kind of questions. All yours.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, sir. That was tour de force. That was a wonderful lecture. You gave so much insight into every aspect and also connecting the issue to the analytical points, which is so important for students like the ones who are studying international relations here. Thank you so much for that. Now the floor is open for questions. You may raise your hands if there are questions, and also if you are unable to unmute yourself or something, you can also post your questions in the chat box, and I'll be happy to take them. So yeah, over to you, sir, all the students and other participants who have joined us. Any questions? Actually, there's one. Okay, I'll wait for them to raise hands. There's one question from a student, Deborah. She's a first-year student. I'll just read it out. So according to her, as per the 2020 statistics by OCHA, food security is at risk. I mean, since you also spoke about the diversity of issues that peacekeepers are also dealing with. So her question is, how is the UN strengthening its strategies under food and security crisis? And since you are engaged with civil protection as a core objective of the UN, how do you think peacekeepers can also contribute to food security or any such issues?
Do I answer that question?
Yes, sir. Yes.
Okay. Deborah, of course, I can't see your face. I don't know who is asking this question. Very interesting question. But I would not answer how UN is handling the food security. This is beyond my scope of discussions. I will not answer that because I'll be wrong if I start passing comments on subject which I really do not know. I am in the deep end. But I'll certainly talk about peacekeepers involved. I'll give an example. In the conflict area, what happened? The food security can be created because of number of reasons. One reason can be because of the effect of the climate. Take the example of South Sudan. When the Nile River dries down slowly and slowly, people who survives essentially on the Nile River, they start migrating inside the country, they live outside the country also. They are basically hungry people, they're looking for food. And the same conflict zone, peacekeeper, the number of agencies are there. There could be WHO also. There are civilian NGOs are there. Could be food storage house. Now, the hungry population, they are not interested who is supposed to provide them the food. To them, they see only the blue color. They expect any international organization, whether the WHO, all peacekeepers, UNICEF, or anyone, there's the angels of God. They will go to them and ask for help. The nearest place they go there is the event base. That is one. So when they go to event base, even peacekeepers, even not mandated, they actually try their best to give them food from their own, authorization that they continue. But how much can you do that? But the second issue is that there are times, the instances that the hungry population, they may go and raid the food storage units. When the food storage units, warehouses try to raid, a lot of your focus of the peacekeepers has to be reoriented, changed towards the security of the warehouses and civilian peacekeepers than for what you were initially aimed at. So basically what happened, again, it comes at the cost of your human resource, that the peacekeepers were doing something else, operational activities, you have to refocus that. There could be reasons that the hungry population, because of the food security, while they're migrating, there are a number of several armed groups, they try to extort from them, including the government forces. Again, even peacekeepers have to intervene. What happened? Your mandate unofficially, or your operational activities unofficially, actually get refocused to saving this protection of the civilians who actually get caught in the crossfire between the fighting warmongers. And that is the one example I tried to give indirectly. At that point of time, how does even intervene? So obviously, moral obligation demand that you, since you have taken oath and you are expected to save innocent human life, you must intervene, even if it may come at your own life. But why it happens or why it does not happen, I have spoken enough. I really cannot pass comment on that. It varies from the senior mission leaders and also the commanders on the ground that time. The tactical commanders are very important. The tactical commanders, they may not listen to anyone. Like some of the countries constantly keep passing instruction to the troop contributing countries, do that or don't do that. Okay, I'll give you one more example. Since how this national interference take place. You know what happened in a peacekeeping operation, it also becomes an operational necessity. There are times to relocate these operational bases of the contingents. Now, some of the contingents, what happened? They find comfort in the bases where they have installed. They get additional money from the country. They have better living accommodations, comforts, food, and a lot of things. They don't want to move out, easily accessible. When they want to move out, technically speaking, that this should not defy the orders. But it's a problem for the force commander head of the missions. Because like I said, participation in the peacekeeping operation by choice. What they can do, they can just pull out. I can tell you once, one of the contingents were asked to shift from one place to another place, slightly more difficult areas. Since I was handling these as a deputy head of the mission, deputy force commander, the behest of the force commander, when the delegation of the contingent came and visited the mission headquarters, we had normal formalities, a discussion with the force commander head of the mission. But the delegation leader, he was a general, he possibly could make out that I was a chief architect of this new concept. So after everybody moved out, we stepped out of the force commander's room. The general told me, "General, can I have a minute with you?" I said, "Yes, why not? You know, you want my contingent to move out. Please don't do that. If you do that, we'll pull out." The discussion ends. So so much of writing concept paper, passing instructions never worked out. So using force to protecting civilians is also a similar challenge. I do not know, Deborah, I have answered your question or not.
Yeah, thank you. Are there any other questions? Those who are working on peacekeeping, especially for their research papers. Okay, yeah, Vajra, can you go ahead?
Yeah. Hi, sir. My question is regarding the articles in the UN Charter that permit regional organizations to take appropriate measures for maintaining international peace. So I have two questions. One is, to what extent do these humanitarian interventions actually contribute to peace and security? If in most cases the conflict is internal and nuanced, and there exists a possibility of escalation, then which will then require a use of force. And secondly, in the case of UN unauthorized intervention, what are the implications of such an action, such as NATO in Yugoslavia, which never really hampered the legitimacy of NATO as an organization? Thank you, sir.
Yeah, your question is interesting questions, and two parts. Firstly, about a regional organization. Yes, there is a thinking in even that, for example, I will quote that they feel that since most of the conflicts are in African region, they say that African problems should be solved by African regions. But what happened? The two things. One is that you need to have these capable peacekeepers. And when I said capable peacekeepers in terms of training, they should be well equipped and well trained. This is not so much available in the African regions when you compare with Western nations. You need support from the other countries. Second, if you go back what Dag Hammarskjöld said when he initially suggested or promoted the concept of three principle impartiality, he said that any member of the permanent, any country who are part of the P5 members must not take part, and also any country who has got geographical political interest must not take part. So in regional organizations, when regional participation take place, you like it or not, there will be interferences. And for instance, you take it, that in Rwanda, what had happened, so many countries are taking part. Generally, it has been seen that it is not found to be successful. So multinational operations actually is better suited than the regional organizations because our own political interest will be there. And in Congo, there is a force, you would have heard about that Force Intervention Brigade. I talk a lot about this Force Intervention Brigade. If you ask an even employee, you will always say it has been a great success. But if you ask those who have served in Congo and come back, they would say it is not, certainly not, because the Force Intervention Brigade itself comprises troops from the countries, regional countries, and they have got one interest or other inside Congo. That is one part. As far as humanitarian intervention is concerned, I do not know if you're referring to these R2P, the responsibility to protect. It was a concept. It was initiated by mostly Western nations. Initially, India had voiced opinion against it. China also did that, presented. But we continue to do that because it is, in concept, it is fine that you use force for responsibility, that we must have the responsibility to protect, to save human lives. But point is that it cannot be selective and it should not be with ulterior motive of regime change. You know, Libya, what had happened? It was actually responsibility to protect concept was invoked. There was a reference in the Security Council, but finally it was only regime change. In Yugoslavia, like I told you, the lack of ability to failure on part of the policymakers to define the problem, and it was non-event operations, although authorized by peacekeeping operations. But you know that everybody knows that Yugoslavia was a big failure. It was a big failure. And so humanitarian intervention, I think if there's a honesty, is non-selective, and it is not aiming to change regime, and should not be only because, you see, if you talk of this humanitarian intervention, then why didn't they intervene in Rwanda when the genocide took place? You know something, when the debate took place, genocide took place, Americans firstly refused to accept it as a genocide, because there's some presidential direction, PDD 25. It says that if you accept it as a genocide, you are forced to. So they will not accept it as a genocide. They did not want to intervene. But when it suits them, they wanted to intervene. So you want other countries, the countries from the global south, to participate in peacekeeping operations, then humanitarian, in the name of humanitarian intervention, but ulterior motive. Getting close to our country, Southeast Asia, you know what is happening. Has anyone intervened in Myanmar? What is happening? No. Why? Chinese are involved there. The P5, obviously they will veto it. Americans are not interested. French not interested. British not interested. Russia doesn't bother them. Will they intervene? They will not. So it is not that easy. So therefore, that I again come back to the same point. The initial stages, when the problem comes up, if you can correctly identify the problem and if you have to address the root causes of conflict, there is a chances of having an inclusive peace agreement and getting a peace operation deployed. There will be, of course, some caveats. I think better chances of success. Otherwise, it is difficult. Have I answered your question, or I'll take it as a diplomatic answer?
Yes,
Vajra?
sir, more or less. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Gargi?
Good morning, sir. I'm Gargi, a second year student at the department. Thank you for that insightful lecture. I really learned a lot. So actually you covered most part of my question. You already covered them earlier, but anyway, I'll go forward with it. So my question is from a decolonial perspective. Now, imperialism and peacekeeping is deeply interrelated due to its savior approach. Also, historically, when we say humanitarianism justified imperial conquest, precisely because so many people believed that savage or primitive people of the world would not embrace civilization unless forced to do so. So, my question is there any way where we can mitigate this dynamic between affected regions and global north? I know you spoke about it, but still.
No, Gargi, is a very interesting question, but let me activate my defense mechanism first, that I am not a political scientist. Okay. But yes, what you said is there's a reason wherever you had gone and seen the peacekeeping operation, there's a direct link between the colonialism and the peacekeeping operations. So I have, yes, you agreed that I have answered the questions, you know, unless these nations who were the colonial power, they decide to pull out, or the nations which they have ruled, they're no more, they become strong enough, like India. India was ruled by Britishers for more than 200 years. But in case of India, at least Britishers cannot dictate us terms like in the African countries, they can dictate terms. Point is that the country get independence, they do not become independent. Maybe it is by design. They do not allow them to become. For instance, like take the example of South Sudan. Now, didn't they expect it, that after 6 years, when the referendum would take place, the South Sudanese population will ask for independence? Second, that if 50% of the oil booty goes to South Sudan, the countries or the factions which fought for a number of years, they will also fight for the war booty. So, to giving or allowing a country to become, or I would say that giving something democracy is not enough. You must have measures, a mechanism in place for the correct gradual transformation of the democracy to a country. So once the peacekeeping operations or the peacekeepers exit from the peacekeeping operations, their job is to create a secure environment, and so that the political process can take the lead. Now, this is a long process. There where it comes, some people call it the peace building, not building infrastructure alone, the political process. So I think everybody is thinking on that, but what happened that the way the conflicts are taking place, where the superpowers or the colonial powers are showing their interest, like for example, in Congo, when the Congo became independent, they wanted, because Katanga region is very rich, they wanted, the Belgium wanted an independent nation part of that, so that they can continue to extract the diamonds. So they deliberated. They said, let them get independent, but we'll follow by the divide and rule policy. Because of what happened far away from their country, any problem which persists, the continuation of the problem continue to give them dividends in terms of money, they will support that problem. But if it's closer to the geographical boundary, their approach will be different. That is the reason why you find that in conflict in Congo continue to persist.
Yeah.
I don't know what.
I think you've answered it. Okay, Delma.
Good morning, sir. I have a doubt regarding the relevance of UN peacekeeping with respect to the situation in Yemen. As we know that Yemen is going through a humanitarian crisis right now, I want to know how far the scope of UN peacekeeping has been extended to that region. Thank you.
Yemen, I don't think the UN office is there. I don't think peacekeepers are there in Yemen. I think the time has crossed for peacekeepers to get deployed, unless you are referring to UN role as such.
I think that it's about the peace mission itself, which
peace mission is, so there are political missions that continue. I don't see any progress, of course. I mean, because you see, it's a big geopolitical complex situation. And on a Middle East specifically, it's a web inside webs. Houthis are there, Arabs are there. Someone is supported by Iran because of the ideological belief, and it suits them. And Saudis do not want a particular kind of resolutions. So it is a difficult proposition, but I would not say that something will not come out. So I would say that it requires, I think, more depth handling. And they are, I think, all diplomats who are good at negotiations and striking a rapport with these people, parties to the conflict are deputed one after another with a hope that something will come out. It may come out, something may come out. Sorry.
Yeah. Okay, Gargi, you have one more question? Okay. Okay, maybe we'll take question from Ajay first. Ajay, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, yes, ma'am. So my question here is regarding the feminist foreign policy that's been adopted by Canada, France, and Mexico, and several other countries as well. So at the regional level, has been how has the African Union integrated gender in its work, especially in the peacekeeping missions inside or internally?
You are referring to participation by UN peacekeepers, both in uniform and civilian, in peacekeeping operations?
Right, sir.
Yeah, see, role of women in peacekeeping operations, whether it is in uniform, outside uniform, is very, very crucial. And there is a policy that in each peacekeeping operation, at least the civilian side, there got to be some percentage of the women peacekeepers, civilian employees. And even he's trying their best to implement that policy. I mean, how far they have progressed, I will not say. It's difficult to say. But as far as the uniformed peacekeepers are concerned, again, it depends from the country to country. I mean, it is expected that all the peacekeeping operations must have, I mean, I would say the good percentage of the women peacekeepers. And in African peacekeeping missions also, I would say the participation by the peacekeeping, women peacekeeping is as good as or as bad as Indian peacekeeping participations. See, firstly, to be able to participate in peacekeeping operations, we do not have any standby force with any other country to participate in peacekeeping operations. And the peacekeeping participation contingents could be the 3,000, 1,000, 2,000. A contingent has to come out of your same armed forces, which is not their primary role. So if armed forces got only 10%, I'm just giving a hypothetical example, 10% women in the armed forces. So I would say that consequently in the participation of the peacekeeping operation could be not be more, could be less. But in case of India, mostly we have been participating as far as women is concerned in terms of doctors and nurses and maybe signal officers. That actually what you can make them available, because our hospitals and all military hospitals, we have got enough nurses, we can take them out. But for any contingent, infantry, fighting arms, we don't have combat soldiers. We do not have combat soldiers. We cannot provide, period. Maybe time will come, maybe a couple of years, 10 years, 20 years hence, if and when. And I hope that this answer will not lead to another debate. If and when it comes, it changes dynamics of the soldiers, women soldiers in the army comes up, changes, I'm sure the participation will change. But some of the contingent I have seen, European contingents, Italian contingents I have seen, Spanish contingent I have seen, their contribution is slightly more than Indians. I think they have got more soldiers in the armed forces than us. That is a different subject, that when you talk to the soldiers about advantage or disadvantage, there are varied opinions, and which is of course not part of this discussion now. But it is an effort on part of the UN to, I think about 23%, 13% something, you are supposed to reach that stage about complete, the gender mainstreaming, they call it. There should be women employee. So any mission headquarters you go, you'll find a lot of women employees are there, both international employees and also local employees. There it is there. You like it or not, you have to adhere to this.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I think I see a couple of hands up, but we will also have to conclude if that's fine.
I don't have problem. I don't have problem. Go ahead.
No, it's fine. So actually, they have another class as well. So that's why maybe we can conclude now. And if it's okay with you, we can also, some of the students who may have questions with regard to peacekeeping or peace building or peace missions in general, I hope they can get in touch with you later on.
Sure.
If that's
anytime.
Fine with you.
Anytime.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. Yeah, thank you so much. That was a great lecture, and also you answered all the questions quite elaborately, and some of them, of course, defensively, like you mentioned, with that caveat always in the beginning. So I'm very happy that all the students could interact with you and gain more knowledge from you. So I would like to now deliver the formal vote of thanks. First of all, a big thank you to Major General Dr. A.K. Bordolai for taking his time out and talking to the students. It's over 1.5 hours now. I'm sure he could go on. I've had conversations with him, and I've seen the kind of enthusiasm he has in speaking with young scholars in particular. So I know him for quite some time now, and I think I got in touch with him for the first time during PhD, and still he was very enthusiastic and he wanted to talk to young scholars, and I'm very sure he would be very happy to talk to anyone from the student crowd. And also we are all students in the end, and we would be happy to interact with you more in the future. So thank you so much, sir, for taking time out and giving this lecture and answering all the questions. I would also like to thank Dr. Nand Kishore, head of the Department of Geopolitics and International Relations, all the other faculty at the department, and also faculty of other departments. So even Dr. Padma Rani, she is the director of Manipal Institute of Communication. She was also part of the meeting today. And her students from Manipal Institute of Communication were also part of the lecture. So thank you so much, ma'am, for joining the lecture. And also let me also reiterate that MIC and certain other institutes of Manipal Academy of Higher Education are also affiliated to the UNESCO Peace Chair. So whatever activities we carry out, it's done in conjunction with each other. So thank you so much. And last but not the least, thank you so much to all the students who have joined us, and some of them have joined us online. And some of them have joined in the classroom, as you can see. So thank you so much for joining us and asking these questions and interacting with sir in a more detailed way. Thank you so much. So hope to see you again, sir, hopefully in person.
Yeah, Dr. Jairam, I must thank you again, once again, for considering me fit to talk to such an informed crowd. I wish that a platform could have been physical, like I said that, and because it's a side effect of pandemic, but I have also learned at this age how to use kind courtesy, different kind of electronic medium.
Yes.
Thank you so much. Thanks for all the students and for giving me a patient hearing. I know it was a monologue, but I suffer from bowel diarrhea. Maybe I start speaking, I don't stop. I'm very sorry, but thank you again. Yeah,
no, not at all. It was great to have you, sir. Bye. Take care.
Thank you. Bye bye.